Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay. I'm here to talk about the death of one of the most prominent figures in American history, American political history, a very controversial individual, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. Now, why I say that he's a very controversial individual, at least what's going on, a very controversial individual is because basically, from my personal belief, he was a war criminal and a warmonger and responsible for the death of many people in many parts of the world, including Cambodia, Argentina, Algeria, and Angola. But to many other people in the American populace, especially those on the right, the conservative end, he was responsible for peace. Now, it is true that in 1973 he was handed the Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating the Paris Peace Accords and ending the war in Vietnam under President Nixon's administration. But, and this is a big but, this is a very big but, before he done that, he also advised President Nixon to carpet bomb the hell out of Cambodia. Many people remember the movie from back in the day called Hamburger Hill about this massacre on Cambodian cities, Kampuchea, as it was called back then. And Cambodians were not even in the war. It was between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. The United States had her allies in South Vietnam going against the North Vietnam communists. Now, it was true that Cambodia was also communist under Pol Pot's regime, the Khmer Rouge, but this was a preemptive strike. Now, the United States claims that they're never for preemptive strikes, that they're against preemptive strikes. They always say that, but the latter half of the 20th century and the 21st century prove that that isn't true. So, in many ways, Henry Kissinger's attitude shaped the policies that the United States now pursues. Get them before they get us. Before they attack them first, even if they had nothing to do with it. And this is very odd considering Henry Kissinger's own personal history, his own personal ethnicities of German Jewish descent. Um, his family escaped the Holocaust, and his family escaped Germany before the Holocaust, the year of Kristallnacht, which we're coming up on the anniversary of. This was 1938, right? This was the event that the Germans, the Nazi regime, Hitler's regime, destroyed all the Jewish businesses, chasing out all of the Jews in all of Germany. He was born in 1933 under he wasn't born in 1933. He came up in 1933 when Hitler first assumed power. So his family escaped Nazi Germany, made their way to the United States. He went to college, grew up in the Washington Heights area of New York, and then eventually entered into politics in 1969. And like I said, his philosophy, his way of thinking influenced the way that the Republican Party would conduct business. As many people know, after World War II, the Cold War, the Soviet Union, and we went over it in many videos, the Soviet Union was the, primary adversary or ideological adversary of the United States. So the United States' philosophy at that time was any regime that showed sympathy to the Soviet Union or to communism at all, they would strike before that because They had their philosophy like, okay, if this specific country falls to communism or this specific country falls under the ideological influence of the Soviet Union, this other country will fall. So if Cuba, for example, like it did in 1959, falls under the influence of communism, then the other countries in Latin America will also fall under the influence of communism. So, in order to prevent that, we have to participate in covert operations to assassinate certain leaders or take out certain leaders and install our own specific leaders that are sympathetic to the cause of capitalism and the cause of the United States and the Western world. So, a perfect example of this would be what he did in the 1970s in Argentina, December 11th, the same date, where he took out the democratically elected leader uh, in Argentina and installed his own their own puppet regime. Same thing in uh, Angola. Angola had a regime that was fighting against the Portuguese, the colonization of the Portuguese that had been there for hundreds of years, and he helped install a regime that was favorable to America and to the West. Same thing in Iran in the 1950s. He wasn't involved with this, but the United States did this too in Iran, taking out Mohammad Mossadegh, who wanted to nationalize the oil industry, and the United States put in the Shah of Iran, who was favorable to the United to our policies, and it was highly unpopular with the Iranian people, and of course was overthrown in 1979. Also, he was involved in a coup in Chile, another coup in Chile. Same thing. Anytime any regime was favorable to socialism or any sort of thing, he would install. He and the United States government and the CIA would install their own puppet dictatorships. And of course, these dictatorships that were backed by the United States would be very oppressive, such as the one that I'm talking about in Latin America, Augusto Pinochet and Salvador Allende. They would be very oppressive to the people. They would kill hundreds of thousands of people in order to make this happen. So here's a man on the one hand who engineered a historic peace process in Vietnam and also was very influential in the Yom Kippur War in bringing that to a settlement. We talked about the Yom Kippur War before because we talked about the greater um, Israel-Palestinian conflict, the Yom Kippur War, of course, when Israel was attacked in 1973 by Egypt, and Henry Kissinger was involved in engineering a peace between those parties. He specifically served under Gerald Ford and Richard Nixon. Of course, Richard Nixon, many people know, a very corrupt president, a very corrupt leader. Uh, like I say, he was like well, Lisa actually said this one, but I said he was like another Trump, but she actually said he was the Trump before Trump, really, because during the 1972 election, he had his people, of course, the book, All the President's Men, his advisors and things, break into the Watergate Hotel, spying on his enemy, Eugene McCarthy, which didn't make any sense anyway because uh, he was going to win the election anyway. You know, I mean, Eugene McCarthy was a very left wing leader, and at that time, the country, specifically the voter electorate, what Nixon called the silent majority, was very pro right wing conservative. So because of the anti-war protests and things like that, the hippie movement, a lot of the older generations, those that were voting and those that were engaged in the political process, were tired of that. And of course, there was racism at that time. Nixon and the Republican Party back then was just like they are right now, preying on the fears of middle class white people, that black people were going to rise up and kill them in their beds. If you don't vote for me, the whole country is going to be taken over by vicious minorities and left wing anarchists. This is the thing that they were preying on, and they were using the same sort of language that you heard from Trump, that you've heard from you heard from Ronald Reagan, you heard from even George H.W. Bush when he paraded during his campaign in 1988 the face of Willie Horton, a prisoner that was released out on furlough and was allegedly accused of murder. This idea that of law and order. You hear this word all the time: law and order, law and order, law and order. It's not just a famous TV show that is on TV that stars Ice-T and Chris Maloney. It also is a dog whistle phrase. When they hear the words law and order, law and order, law and order, what that means to them is, I'm going to suppress civil rights. I'm going to suppress the rights of blacks and other black people and other minorities. I'm going to basically use the power of the law, the power of the police department across the country to oppress people of color. This is what you hear, the words law and order, but that's not what they hear. They hear something else. They hear the racism implicit in that. So it's not what they say, it's what they don't say. And Nixon was the start of that, the Southern strategy. We all know and are familiar, I guess. Those that know political history are familiar with what that is. What that basically is, or was, is they go around the country and they say these hidden phrases, these phrases that have multiple meanings. That they mean one thing, but they actually mean another thing. And law and order is one of them. And they go specifically to the South and they target these white voters, these white voters that are racist, and they have fears, fears of black people rising up and, killing them, even though that's not going to happen because, really, if it hasn't happened yet, it's never going to happen, but they prey on their fears. You saw it in 2020, you saw it in 2016, you saw it basically throughout all American history. And this works best in the South because the South was the place where most racial injustices were committed against people of color. Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Democrats in the early part of the 20th century and the latter half of the 19th century, they were good at this. It was called the Solid South for many years until 1964, when Barry Goldwater was the first Republican in history to ever get any votes in the South by saying he opposed the Civil Rights Bill. And then in 1968, Nixon comes along, and Nixon says, "Wait a minute. The way the Republicans could win this election is by appealing to those specific racist voters. By telling them, well, when I get in the White House, I'm going to install law and order. I'm going to install law and order." And they know what that meant, And then subsequently, he does that again in 72. Reagan does it even worse in 1980. He does it even worse in 1984. George the First, he does it in 88. George Bush Jr. does it in 2000 when he implicitly points to the race of John McCain's adopted daughter, implying that she's black, even though she's from Bangladesh. She was just dark skinned, kind of like nudging them, like saying, look, he has a daughter of color, right? And of course, that causes them to not vote for John McCain. And then we saw it again in 2008. Of course, even worse, we saw it with Barack Obama, them trying to imply that Barack Obama was, a secret Muslim. Then in 2012, 2016, basically, I've seen it throughout my whole entire life. But we're getting really off topic. Henry Kissinger was one of those guys. He was the last Nixon, the last Cold Warrior, the last guy to really be one of those war hawks. But it's not necessarily him that endures, but his legacy that endures. The legacy of neoconservatism in the foreign policy sector, the legacy of going after them before they go after us, the ideas of the neocons, the ideas that we must go to war, that the United States legacy thrives off war. If we don't have war, we have nothing. The building up of the military industrial complex, which President Eisenhower warned about when he left office in 1960, and has gotten even worse over the years. You know what I mean? And there always has to be a new boogeyman. There always has to be a new threat on the horizon for these people, because there has to be a new justification for war. If it's not the communist in Cuba, then it's the communist in Vietnam, or the communist in China, or the communist in Russia. If it's not the communist in those countries, it's Saddam Hussein in 1991, or it's the Islamists in the war on terror, or it's uh, Vladimir Putin in the war in Ukraine, or it's Hamas right now. There's always this new boogeyman, this new justification for going to war. And really, besides the big neoconservatives, like Henry Kissinger, with the Henry Kissinger esque philosophy, people are really tired of this sort of thing. You know what I'm saying? People are really tired of the United States using her power to push around other smaller nations, using preemptive war, always beating the drum of war. What's the next nation we're going to take out? What's the next regime we're going to dispose and put in our own puppet government like we had for 20 years in Afghanistan? You know what I mean? So, in a sense, giving him credit where credit is due for the things that he achieved diplomatically, like opening ties to China. But of course, opening ties to China at that time was only strategic. It was seen as a way to alienate the Soviet Union. It wasn't necessarily because the Soviet Union and China, even though they were two communist countries, by the mid 1960s, they had begun to have um, problems with one another. There was the Sino-Soviet split, so they weren't necessarily on the same page. So the United States thought, okay, by making peace with China, and and at the same time simultaneously encouraging détente with Russia, if war were ever to break out with Russia, at least we would have China as an ally, and of course for trading purposes, because China was on the brink of um, liberalizing their economy. So they would be a trading partner. And ultimately, for corporations to open up their manufacturing plants in China, which they ultimately did, which has now led to a lot of economic decline within Middle America. Because before we opened the floodgates to China in the mid 70s, when he was Secretary of State, we were the chief um, economic producer. Now we no longer are. So a lot of this stuff that he engineered, especially in the foreign policy area, endures with us to this day. So it's not the legacy of the man. I mean, most people didn't even know who he necessarily was, unless they were students, serious students of Cold War history. But his legacy, the stuff that the policies that he engineered, or the way he conducted business, still endures with us today. It's interesting that he ended the war in 1973 and Nixon got in 68. And Nixon campaigned on a message of peace, getting us out of the war in Vietnam, because Vietnam was highly unpopular with the American people. especially in the late '60s. After 1968, the Tet Offensive, really after 1964, uh, after we found out that the Gulf of Tonkin incident was basically a lie, that was a lie, that was used as a justification. Apparently, the Vietnamese communists had attacked one of our ships, the USS Maddox, and then we found out years later that never happened. But that was used as a justification by President Johnson to escalate in Vietnam. And once we found out that was a lie, and he continued to launch further strikes, especially the vicious Tet Offensive in 1968, people were like, okay, I'm fed up with this already. And anti war protests increased. And we talked about it when we talked about it when we reviewed the movie, the Sacha Baron Cohen movie, The Chicago Seven, where there was a huge riot in the city of Chicago in 1968 during the Democratic National Convention. Uh, where protesters were going against um, the Democratic Party and President Johnson, or not President Johnson, because Johnson was so unpopular that he had declined to run his second term. But against the Democrats in general, they rioted in the whole city. So they were ready to get rid of the Democrats and elect a Republican, some of the anti-war people. But Nixon furthered the war in Vietnam by expanding it to another country and expanding it to the whole of Southeast Asia. So much like Trump, here you had Trump campaigning uh, as a peacemaker in Afghanistan, right? But Trump's whole 4 years in Afghanistan, we were still in Afghanistan. He didn't get us out at all. And he only escalated in the war in Syria. Remember that photo of that little kid in I think it was 2016, 2017, where the little kid is all covered in dust and he was bombed out by Trump. You know what I mean? So although Trump's like with Nixon, Trump campaigned on a peace promise. Actually, he was looking to, and if you read Bob Woodward's book, he was looking to, which we have a review of on this channel, he was looking to expand the war in the Middle East much further. But much like Nixon or much like Johnson or any of these other presidents, they needed a reason. They needed a casus belli, what they call in Latin. Right back in the Roman Empire, that was used as a justification to go to war with the Carthaginians. Right, they needed a justification to go to war. You just can't go to war, just because. Right, you need a reason. You need something to happen that will sway the opinion of the public to say, okay, yeah, now I'm on board with war. Because if you go to war just because, then people will say, well, you're unjustly attacking them. But if you can vilify your opponent and you can make your opponent look like the bad guy through some kind of incident, either a real incident or something that's orchestrated by you. See October 7th and the music attack. Yes, it did happen, okay? It was a vicious attack by Hamas, but at the same time, the response on the Israeli side was not as measured. So it's the same thing here. It's like Trump was just looking, like Nixon was, looking for a reason to expand the war in the Middle East and expand it to other territories and looking to expand it to Iran. He wasn't looking to pull us out of Afghanistan, because if he were looking to pull us out of Afghanistan, he would have pulled us out of Afghanistan, which he didn't do. We stayed in Afghanistan until 2021. And Biden was already the president by then. And of course, he criticized Joe Biden's departure from Kabul, just like the parallels are uh, the parallels are crazy because the same thing happened with Henry Kissinger's administration with Nixon. You know, they were looking to pull out in 73. They signed the Paris Peace Accords in 73, but they didn't pull out fully until 2 years later in 75 when Gerald Ford was already the president. He was already the president, and it was disastrous because as soon as a couple of weeks later after we pulled out in 75, the people we were fighting, the Vietnamese communists, took over the country anyway. You know what I mean? So that's why they say we lost the war in Vietnam, because the objectives were not achieved. Our objectives was to champion the democratic side, the side that we championed in South Vietnam, and that didn't happen. So we basically lost the war. And not only did we lose the war, but just like with Afghanistan, people came back drug addicted. People came back with social problems. See the movie, see the Lorenz Tate movie from the '90s, Dead Presidents, with Bokeem Woodbine and Lorenz Tate. It's a very good take on how Vietnam vets were treated, or the Spike Lee movie that came out in 2020, The Five Bloods, for how Vietnam vets were treated. You know, just basically like shit. Because why? The American public wasn't on board with this war. You know what I mean? They felt like we stayed in too long, just like they feel like with Afghanistan. It was a very hostile homecoming for them. It wasn't like the homecoming in World War II. It was totally different. You know what I'm saying? You see the pictures of people coming back from Vietnam, and you see people spitting on them, calling them baby killers, you know, throwing shit at them. And you see the pictures of people coming home from World War II in 1945, and it was totally different. You know, random girls going up to soldiers in the case of World War II and kissing them, you know, just kissing them, making out with them on the street, looking at them as heroes. Whereas in Afghanistan and Vietnam and Iraq, we kind of look at them as, you know, the bad guys, because these wars were unnecessary. These wars were to further grandiose political ideology, be it anti-communism in the case of Vietnam, uh, Cambodia, and the wars in Central America in the 1980s, or anti-terrorism in the case of the war on terror in Iraq and Afghanistan. The Americans weren't behind these sort of wars, and plus, media had gotten more advanced during the late 20th century, the late 20th century, early 21st century, differently than World War II. And also because, too, we weren't directly attacked. Now, as we were in World War II. Afghanistan, we were directly attacked by Al Qaeda, but like Lisa and I have discussed on the channel before, once we got Osama bin Laden in 2011, okay, he's dead now. We should be out of there, but we continue to stay there for another 10 years. You know what I mean? So, I mean, imagine if we'd have stayed in Germany during World War One for another 10 years. So imagine, well, we kind of did stay in Japan, at least economically, forever, and we're kind of still there now. So World War II is a bad example. And I don't know, the American public didn't care that we atomically bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki and wiped them off the map. But I mean, you know, that's another topic entirely. But Henry Kissinger's legacy is a very controversial legacy. There's a good book by Christopher Hitchens, basically detailing all of the war crimes that he done. You know, during he being Henry Kissinger's two administrations that he worked for, all that he was responsible for. Anthony Blinken, who is the current Secretary of State, paid tribute to him. But this position of Secretary of State is a very unenviable position. Nobody really wants to be in this position because Okay, the president gives the okay to go to war, but this is basically this person that occupies this position. Hillary Clinton had it, Condoleezza Rice had it, Colin Powell had it, um, but nobody besides the Secretary of State under FDR and the Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson was as close to a president as Henry Kissinger was to Richard Nixon. Basically, Nixon was signing off on it, but Henry Kissinger was really making the moves, and that's really how it kind of is now. Not as close, but this is basically the president's right hand man when it comes to war. It basically dictates who he goes to war with, who he or she. There's never been a she, but if there ever is a she president, who he or she goes to war with. You know what I mean? This is why Hillary Clinton was very unpopular because people considered it people considered her engineering the invasion. I did too. At the time, I was speaking against it. I didn't have a YouTube channel, but I was speaking against it, especially for somebody who voted for Barack Obama. The invasion of Libya, and we saw how that turned out. You know, what I mean, that was another blunder. I think that one there was Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama's biggest blunder was Libya, because we overthrew Muammar Gaddafi at the same time. But like I covered in my 2019 review video, after that, the people that took over in Libya started enslaving the African population. And of course, uh, Muammar Gaddafi was working for the financial independence of all of the African people, and of course, the people that control the United States financially, the controller, the owners and controllers of global financialized capital, as Shai Bolson here on YouTube calls them, weren't looking, weren't looking for that to happen. They were looking for the West, to continue to control it, and that was a huge mistake, invading Libya. So my point in saying all this is that this position of Secretary of State that Kissinger had is a very position that you don't really want to be in, because whether you're Mike Pompeo, who was it under Trump, or whomever, you know, you just don't want to be there, because every decision you make is going to be criticized by the American people. And basically, since Vietnam, no war has been really popular with the people, except for Afghanistan in the beginning. So whether you're talking about Clinton in Kosovo in 1998, or Obama in 2011, 2012 with Libya, or Bush in 2003 with Iraq, none of these wars have been popular with the people, because we're like, okay, it's been war after war after war after war. And after a while, people just get tired of the same thing. And I think that's where people are right now. People are like, enough already. I mean, we've been going nonstop wars in various parts of the world for the last 50, 60 years. You know what I'm saying? When's it going to end? I'm like, when are we going to have a period of genuine peace where we as the United States can say, you know what? There's always going to be ethnic conflict. There's always going to be ethnic strife, ethnic derision around the world, but we can't be the world police for everybody. We can't go around trying to solve all the world's problems. But of course, the hyper capitalists, the organizers and controllers of global financialized capital, they're not going to allow that to happen. You know what I'm saying? They're not going to let that happen. They're going to use the military power of the United States to bully other nations. So when somebody like Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe rises up, you're always going to have your little Henry Kissinger acolytes, the people that follow Henry Kissinger's military and political philosophy rising up and trying to overthrow them and put somebody in power that is favorable to our globalized agenda. You know what I'm saying? So you got somebody like Gaddafi that he opposes that. You want to overthrow Gaddafi. You got somebody like Mugabe that opposes that in Zimbabwe. You're gonna try to overthrow Mugabe. You got somebody like that in Venezuela, like uh, uh, Hugo Chavez. You're gonna try to overthrow that person and put Juan Guaido in power in Venezuela, which they were trying to do in the late 2010s. You got somebody like that in another part of the world. They're gonna get rid of that person and put somebody in power that they want because they want somebody that's favorable to them. Now, take for example China, right? They say Blinken and Blinken, his Secretary of State, Biden, the president, if China ever invades Taiwan, they're going to strike against China. But if you're putting your military apparatus in the South China Sea and then you provoke China and then China reacts and then you use that Chinese reaction as a justification for you to go to war with China to overthrow the Chinese regime, weren't you the one that started it? I mean, you didn't start it by throwing the first punch, but you provoked it. You know what I'm saying? It's like if you pick on somebody, right, in school, right? Say let's simplify this to a schoolyard. I mean, at least it's saying we would be in trouble. Let's simplify this to a schoolyard uh, analogy, right? Say in school, right? Somebody is picking on you and picking on you and picking on you and picking on you. They're not hitting you, but they're teasing you every single day. They're provoking you. They're poking at you. They're calling you names. They're calling you out your name. They're trying to dish you every single day. And then you respond and you beat the loving shit out of them. But then, and this happened to me. This happened to me in the fifth grade. So I'm speaking from personal experience. In the fifth grade, somebody was teasing me, somebody was teasing me, somebody was teasing me every single day. So finally, as many people know, of course, in the background you can see I'm in a wheelchair, but at that time I was using the manual wheelchair. So I took the armbar of the wheelchair and started beating this person up, you know. But all the teacher saw was me. You know what I'm saying? She only saw me retaliating and beating the kid up. She didn't see what the kid had done prior to that that made me do that. You know what I'm saying? That didn't happen in a vacuum. I was only responding to the kid teasing me. You know what I'm saying? Because I always been a pacifist. I always tried to make peace with people, try to be cordial with people, try to be nice to people. And I let the kid do it for months and months. The teasing actually started in the beginning of fourth grade. You know what I mean? So it was going back a year and a half, right? And I let it slide for months, and it was brutal. You know, it was to the point where I didn't even want to go to school anymore. But when I finally retaliated, I was considered a bad guy. So it's like that on the global level with politics, guys. You know what I mean? If the United States continues to provoke China and provoke China and provoke China by having ships show up, having their navy show up, having their marines show up in China's territory, which you already know that China considers Taiwan to be a part of itself. You know what I mean? We know that. You know what I'm saying? China never ever considered Taiwan's independence. They consider Taiwan to be their own territory. So it wouldn't be from their point of view them invading Taiwan. They consider Taiwan part of them. You know what I'm saying? It'd be like if the United States invaded Puerto Rico, would that be considered an invasion of a foreign nation? No, it wouldn't be, because we consider as Puerto Rico as part of the United States. And that's how China considers Taiwan. Now, the United States doesn't consider Taiwan as that. The United States recognizes uh, implicitly two Chinas. They recognize Taiwan's sovereignty and they recognize the legitimacy of the People's Republic of China, the mainland of China. But we have said that if they ever invade, quote unquote, or if they ever send troops to the island of Taiwan, then we would take action and we would defend Taiwan, just like we said with the Ukraine and Russia, right? If the Ukraine was invaded by Russia, we would take action. But what were we doing? What was the United States and NATO doing in the mid 2000s to provoke Russia? We were sending NATO operatives there. We were trying to get Ukraine into NATO and sending NATO troops, which is basically a puppet organization that represents Western interests. So we were provoking Russia, right? So when Russia retaliated and then Russia finally took action and said, wait a minute, this is a violation of a treaty that we signed way back, during the Gorbachev-Reagan years, all the public saw was Russia's retaliation. It was just like me with that teacher. You know what I'm saying? All they saw was Russia's retaliation. All we're going to see in the news, if that ever hypothetically happens with China, is going to be China's retaliation. It's going to be, look, oh, China attacked the United States, or China invaded Taiwan, which now all of a sudden the United States considers a sovereign nation, even though they didn't 5 minutes ago, right? They recognize a one China policy, not a two China policy, right? That's all we're going to see is China's retaliation. We're not going to look at it like, well, what was the United States doing before to provoke that? What was the West doing before to provoke that? You know what I'm saying? Just like, again, I keep bringing it back to this, but Israel and Hamas. We see Hamas, what they done, but we never saw what led up to that. You know what I'm saying? Why were they doing that? People just don't randomly go attacking other people for no specific reason, especially nations that have a lot to lose as far as their populace. You know what I mean? Most nations are not going to put their populace out there to die in senseless wars if they don't have to, except if they're countries, like the United States and its rich people. Rich politicians are not putting their sons and daughters on the front lines to die. They're putting your sons and daughters on the front lines to die in their wars to further their financial growth and prosperity. And Lisa's absolutely right. If we were to ever go to war with China, we would be in trouble. Be in a lot more trouble with China than we would with other countries. Because we're not dealing, when it comes to China, we're not dealing, and this still is relevant to Henry Kissinger's life because he worked a lot, like I said, diplomatically as far as with China. This is one of the reasons why I believe he made the peace deal with China in the first place. We're not dealing necessarily with not even necessarily, we're not dealing with at all something like Hamas or a terrorist group that's just a ragtag bunch of people that have old school weapons that they acquired maybe from the Soviet Union, back in the 70s and 80s. We're not dealing with those type of individuals. We're dealing, when it comes to China, with a country of over like 5 million people, with a highly equipped military, an advanced technological nation. By a family member of mine used to call it a sleeping giant. You know what I mean? China. And that's why we never wanted to mess with it. You know what I mean? But the United States seems to keep pushing that line with China. First with Trump attacking them after the coronavirus, and then sending Nancy Pelosi over there last year to Taiwan, and then using our popular culture to try and influence the people. Try to get them to, especially in Hong Kong and other places. And John Cena, the wrestler, was a huge part of this, and we talked about how he was used in a few videos as a puppet, as a prop, on behalf of both sides of the Chinese government. And he made that mistake of calling Taiwan a separate nation, and that's when he got in trouble with the Chinese government for. But what I'm saying is, for the last 10 or 15 years, we've been using popular entertainment to try and influence the Chinese government, to the Chinese people to turn against their government, because that's the big jackpot. I mean, that's the one that if that ever happened, if we ever went to war with China, the United States, and overthrew the Chinese Communist Party, that's the one that we would consider like we won the entire jackpot. You know what I mean? Because that's the one that been a thorn in the United States' side forever, because they have an antagonistic ideology to the United States. They're communist, and they're not really necessarily an ally with the United States, but they're more economically prosperous than the than the United States. I mean, they make more money than the United States. All of our stuff is manufactured in China, most of it. And all of our businesses have moved locations to China, overseas to China, because of cheap labor. You know what I'm saying? So if we could overthrow the Chinese and we could be number one on the economic and global stage, then we would consider as we won. But that's the big if. You know what I'm saying? Because unless China attacked us, you know what I'm saying? Unless they attacked one of our cities, presumably Los Angeles, which is closer to them geographically than, say, New York, there's no way that the American people would ever be on board with attacking China or going to war militarily with China, because our morale is very low. We're sick and tired of these wars. We don't care that a lot of us don't really care. Sorry to say, sorry to be so blunt. A lot of us don't really care necessarily that China or Russia attacks their neighbors. We're like, okay, let China and Taiwan sort it out. Let Russia and Ukraine sort it out. We are taking care of our own self. We want to focus on our own self. Like I said, it's an isolationist. It's an isolationist mindset, that many Americans have nowadays. You know what I'm saying? Because we're worn out. We have fatigue. You know what I'm saying? There's only so much a people and a person or an individual or a nation or a group of people could take. And I think we've had it. You know what I'm saying? So this type of diplomacy or this type of governmental work that somebody like Henry Kissinger did, we're not up for it nowadays in 2023. You know what I mean? There's TikTok, which TikTok is if we ever hypothetically went to war with China, uh, TikTok would be kind of iffy because they're controlled by the Chinese government. And believe me, the Chinese government is very intrusive. The Chinese government is not a perfect government, or anything. I'm not necessarily sticking up for them. I know they have human rights violations on their hands, especially as it concerns their Muslim population in the West. We talked about it before, how um, companies like Disney are just shell for them and sold out for them. But Henry Kissinger and the government of the United States opened the door for that in the 1970s. You know what I mean? So they only have their self to blame. Anyway, guys, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell button to see my next videos coming out. Love you guys. Thank you, Lisa, for contributing. Thank you, everybody, for watching.